For Crimo Media's Polity, I'm Tabi Shomolekai. Joining me today is author Dr. Treive Nicholas, here to unpack his book titled In Search of Nongqawuse. Your book delves into the story of Nongqawuse and the Great Xhosa cattle killing after 1956 to 1957, a historic event where the Xhosa people followed a prophecy that led to widespread destructions. So, Dr. Treive, can you tell us more about your fascination with the Wild Coast?
Well, my fascination with the Wild Coast all started when I was 19, back in 1980. I worked in the Transkei at Ikwezi Local Special School Umtata, and I was working there as a teacher and as a coach to the paraplegic sports team for Transkei. And whilst there, I'd occasionally take a break down to the Wild Coast, and so I got to see it from Mkombati in the north all the way down to the Kai River. And I was fascinated then. I mean, it really is stunningly beautiful. The history associated with the Wild Coast it varies as you move along. And I've had the pleasure and good fortune to travel all around the world in my working life. But I've come back to the Wild Coast on several occasions, and I find it never disappoints. I'm always taken by the beauty and how secluded it is.
And about the title of your book, In Search of Nongqawuse, I mean, you say it's a search that turned out to be personal, both physically and spiritually. How so?
Well, I was reading about the history of Nongqawuse in order to write my first book, A Nun and the Pig, and I decided to read Nongqawuse history. And then I came across this unbelievable story about a teenage girl, a prophetess, that had had these visions which led to the killing of 40,000 Nongqawuse, 400,000 cattle dead, and the displacement of 150,000. And when I read it, first of all, I was shocked by discovering what I thought was like a Shakespearean type story. It read like a Macbeth or a Hamlet with large characters, visceral stories. I was really quite amazed. Secondly, I was taken back that I'd worked in the Eastern Cape and visited on many occasions, but I'd never heard of this story. And so I felt slightly deceived. Why was this African history being hidden from me? And the third thing that gripped me was the story suggested that these monumental events were all caused by a 15-year-old orphan girl. And quite frankly, I didn't believe it. I didn't like it. It felt like injustice. It felt like prejudice. It almost felt like one of these murder mysteries you watch on the television, where that you can see who the bad person is straight away, and that person's being framed. And that's how I felt. I thought, this young woman is being framed, and there must be much more to this story. And I got, as you will have read, a little bit gripped by the story, and I started what I call my pilgrimage to find a fuller truth that better explains the events of 1856.
And talking about the prophecy, can you tell us more about the reason behind the acceptance of the prophecy, and how did Nongqawuse persuade all her countrymen to follow the prophecy?
And that is the nub of the book and the question. So the first thing I say to you and to anybody who wants to understand the cattle killing, you have to take off your 21st century hat and put it over here. And you have to put a new one on, which is mid-1800s, and somehow imagine that you're Nongqawuse and the values that they had. And you have to understand, firstly, how much pressure I believe Nongqawuse society was under at that time. They had had 8 frontier wars, brutal, losing tens of thousands of people, women, men, children, losing cattle. Their land had been encroached on by settlers, so they had less land. They had cattle disease, they had crop disease. They had greater influence of magistrates over the chief's administration. The chief himself, Sakhili, had personal and political problems. His father had been shot and mutilated 20 years earlier. So it was a society under huge stress. They tried to fight the British, they tried to make treaties with the British, and they tried to ignore the colonialists. And none of it had worked. So you can imagine, I try and say, paint a picture of a time where there's a lot of stress in that society. The other thing we've got to remember is that prophets such as Makanda and Kwela and Mkhanjeni had been making similar prophecies some 5 and 20 years, 30 years earlier. Kill your cattle, ancestors will return, and remove the Europeans and life will be better. So it was not a new particular prophecy, it was something that was circulating in the Eastern Cape. And I believe when a teenage girl, Nongqawuse, went and had these visions and reported them, first of all to her uncle, I think it was falling on receptive ears. If in previous decades the ears had been closed because the consequences would have been too severe, by the mid-1850s I think perhaps circumstances were so difficult that they fell on receptive ears. And I think particularly her uncle and maybe the king, Sakheli, used the young girl to their benefit. Her uncle, and particularly Sakheli, he was a man that knew his way around and wanted to, I think, curry favour with the king. And I think she was possibly manipulated, used to their ends. I always say this, we're sitting here talking today about Nongqawuse and the dreadful tragedy of the cattle killing, yeah? And how it's awful and it's all the girl's fault. Let's turn the tables for a second. Imagine if the cattle killing had been a great success, the fresh cattle had returned and the settlers had been driven into the sea. Would you and I be sitting here today talking about Nongqawuse? No, we'd be sitting here talking about the wise King Sakheli and the wonderful Mhlakaza. In my view, she was a scapegoat when things went badly wrong.
And can you tell us more about the challenges you faced in trying to deal with the past and the present sensibilities?
Well, first of all, I had worked with Amangqawuse in 1980 as a teacher. So when I came across this story, I'm not saying I was completely au fait, but I had some knowledge and understanding, and I'd worked with lots of Amangqawuse and Amampondo and Haleka. So I had some idea of the cultural sensitivities. What was clear that whenever I talked about the cattle killing to South Africans, particularly black South Africans, it was still a very hugely sensitive subject. I treated it as a intrigue, or my curiosity was sparked and I thought there was an injustice. But whenever I spoke to Amangqawuse, one reaction was sort of leave it alone, or the other reaction, which was more common, was just literally to roll their eyes and say, oh, that stupid girl, or oh, Nongqawuse. So just in day-to-day dialogue, it was clear that this was a very sensitive subject. And so when writing this, I tried to reflect that in my writing. You may spot that I'm a white European from the UK. I tried, not to be dishonest, but I tried to put some of that to one side, and I tried to think like an Amangqawuse in the mid-19th century, because if I didn't do that, the whole thing didn't make sense. I mean, your viewers, everybody, when you look at it in the cold light of day, it's a complete and utter nonsense. It doesn't make sense in our 21st century sensibilities. So I had to start thinking like a 19th century person and understand the circumstances, and that's what I tried to do. And I'm pleased to say that the feedback I've had would suggest I'm getting more right than wrong, but others will be the judge, I'm sure.
Your book also points to psychological and political insights in which you show how colonial trauma played out in decisions that were taken. Can you tell us more on this?
Sure. No, I believe colonial trauma was actually at the heart of all this. You know, when people say what caused the cattle killing, was it the girl, was it the uncle? No, I think at the nub of this, the root of this, was trauma. It had been, as I mentioned, 8 frontier wars have been going on. The chiefs have been personally humiliated by some of the British officials, and I give an example of Sir Harry Smith. Great men like Manhoma had their necks stepped on and been insulted and called dogs. What's that going to do? King Hintsa, who was Sakheli's father, had gone to negotiate with the British, only to find that he'd been arrested and then later on chased across the Haleka land to the Ngqabaga River, and where he had been shot at close range. This is, I think, some of the deep-seated causes of why the cattle killing took place, and why the cattle killing did not start earlier in the 19th century. Things had got so dreadful. Recently, from 1834 up to the 1850s, they had the War of Hintsa, the War of the Axe, and War of Umhlangeni. They had been brutal. Many Amangqawuse had died. Lots of land had been taken, burnt. There was almost a scorched earth policy in some places where crops were destroyed. I think the society was in a state of trauma and didn't know which way to turn. And it was fertile ground for people coming up with what would seem, from our current perspective, slightly outrageous or unreasonable opportunities or exits. But they fell on fertile ears, fertile ground in 1856 because people were desperate.
And lastly, Dr. Treive, what are you hoping readers take away after reading your book?
I wanted to just tell the story. I researched this simply because I was so curious. I couldn't put this story to bed, or I couldn't let it go until I'd got to what I thought was a more realistic truth. I'd like people to understand more about this traumatic event, not to fester in it, but almost to put it away and understand that you've got to look a little more deeply, that when this happens, it's not just the fault of a 15-year-old girl. A 15-year-old orphan girl, there is more to it than meets the eye, and there are some root causes, and it helps explain Amanghausa history of why this event's happened. So it helps explain the past in a more truthful, honest way. I think we've also got to have one eye on the future. We're in the 21st century and we're bulletproof, aren't we? Well, no, we're not. At times when people lose hope, and during times of difficulty, it's fertile ground for people with outrageous or broad or big solutions to prosper. And I think that can happen as much today as it could 160 odd years ago. So we need to be mindful. People without hope, people in desperate situations, will react in a way that's not always predictable, and the consequences can be very serious.
That was Dr. Treive Nicholas speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about In Search of Nongqawuse.